This is the Forum on the Changing Landscape of Jewish Life and its Implications for Reform Judaism. My name is Jane Wishner. I'm from Congregation Albert in Albuquerque, New Mexico. I have been on the Board of Trustees of the URJ for about 12 years and have served on the Commission on Social Action of Reform Judaism since many years before that. I'm a past chair of the Commission on Social Action, and I am also a newly elected member of the new Oversight Committee for URJ. I am very honored to be here today. I grew up in Chicago, and there was a great tradition at the Hillel of the University of Chicago. Every year there is an annual debate between leading scholars, academicians, on which is better, the latke or the hamantashen. Because we're so close to Hanukkah, clearly it's the latke, and so that didn't seem to be like a good debate today. But we are going to have a variation on a very traditional Jewish debate. Is the glass half full or is it half empty? And it is my honor to present to you first. We have two speakers today, Len Saxe and Stephen Cohen. Professor Saxe will be starting first. I will introduce him. He will have a PowerPoint that will be on the screen on this side, just so people know. Leonard Saxe, PhD, is Klutznick Professor of Contemporary Jewish Studies and Social Policy at Brandeis University. He directs the university's Cohen Center for Modern Jewish Studies and the Steinhardt Social Research Institute. Professor Saxe is a social psychologist and methodologist. His current research focuses on Jewish identity and engagement. He leads a program of research developing estimates of the size and characteristics of the American Jewish population, and as well directs a longitudinal evaluation of the impact of Israel education. Professor Saxe is an author or editor of more than 300 publications, including a 2008 book, 10 Days of Birthright Israel, A Journey in Young Adult Identity, and a 2004 volume about Jewish summer camping, How Goodly Are They Tents, Summer Camps as Jewish Socializing Experiences. He has been a science fellow for the United States Congress, a Fulbright professor at Haifa University, and received the American Psychological Association's Prize for Distinguished Contributions to Psychology in the Public Interest Early Career. Please welcome Professor Saxe.
Hatzarayim Tovim. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I hope we can fulfill the expectation of a debate. It will at least be a lively and I hope important discussion. For those who were present at the plenary session last night and heard Wendy Mogul's description of some of the issues that those of us who are parents face today, you may recall that she talked about the problem that schools have of differentiating children on the basis of their talents. And she described in particular the teacher who divided students into three groups based on their musical ability, and how that wouldn't be possible today. Well, just so everybody knows, I was the kid in the listen group. And it's relevant because I've titled the subtitle of my presentation, taken from Dylan, is "The Times They Are A-Changin'." But as a special bonus to you, I won't try to do a riff on Dylan. I won't try to sing it. But what I do want to talk about is contemporary Jewish life in particular for liberal reform Jews, and how what we think today is the situation is maybe different than what it actually is, and how perhaps our stereotypes of what the community was have influenced how we currently think. So, I'm going to give you two images. The first image of contemporary Jewish life is what I will call the melting ice cube. It's actually a metaphor that's been used by an author, a member of the community, Scott Shea, in his book, Getting Our Groove Back. And his thesis was that we are, as American Jews, melting away, melting into assimilation. And I want to contrast that with the metaphor of a growing tree. Community that is growing, community that needs water and sun and some care. And I want to describe two competing narratives of contemporary Jewish life. The first one, the decline, the lachrymose narrative, probably the dominant narrative. Everybody has heard it. Liberal Judaism is unsustainable. We are disappearing, assimilating, intermarrying away. The non-Orthodox liberal Jews are uninterested as a group in engagement. Our core institutions, our synagogues, our federations, etc., are irrelevant. I want to contrast this to what I call the growth narrative. Jewishness is in. It's actually cool, attractive to be a Jew in 2011. Jewish education over the last 20 years has been reinvented. The Hebrew school that I went to, the Hebrew school that many of you went to, the Hebrew school that Eric Yaffe has so eloquently described at a previous biennial, is not the Hebrew school of today. Summer camps are not the camps of today. Travel engagement with Israel is actually increasing, particularly among young people, and new Jewish institutions are proliferating. So I want to give you, just so you know what the basis of the lachrymose narrative is and what the basis of my assertions about the growth narrative are, I want to give you three descriptions that appear in the literature today about the American Jewish population, not just the Reform population. So the red line is the Shea based on the National Jewish Population Survey. And what it shows is a steady decline projected to increase over time, with the share of American Jews as a portion of the total American population decreasing substantially. My colleague and friend Sergio Della Pergola, also using some of the same data, but also his own analyses, has a slightly more optimistic, if a straight line, a flat line is optimistic. And then, while I've been accused of exuberancy and wishful thinking and optimism, the top line is our latest estimate of the size of the American Jewish population. In fact, and I think the evidence is incontrovertible, there are now 6.5 million people, including children, who declare themselves to be Jewish, or they declare their children to be Jewish, and that rate is actually increasing. Now, you skeptics in the audience may say, what's wrong with you, Saxe? Where do you get such numbers? What explains the growth? Well, first, we've had incredible immigration, relatively incredible immigration, to the United States from the former Soviet Union, from Israel, South America, Canada. Second of all, intermarriage. Now, you may be surprised to see this on the list of factors leading to growth. But number one, the very courageous decision of Schindler and the Union to accept patrilineal descent has made it possible for thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Jews who did not before consider themselves to be Jews. They may have felt it, but they knew enough not to consider themselves Jews to say that they're Jewish. Conversion. And related to how Jewishness is in, the increased identification with Judaism and with Jewishness, in part as a result of our expanded and our better educational systems. Now, what limits growth? And these, if you will, are the cautions. These are the red lights, particularly for the Reform movement. what you are raised in, and I'm going to show you data on each one of these in a moment, what you are raised as, whether you're raised in the Reform movement, the conservative movement, the Orthodox, unorthodox movement, does not mean that's what you are going to be as an adult. Just Jewish is actually the fastest growing non-denomination denomination. Intermarriage totally depends, and I'll show you the data about this, on whether children are raised as Jews. And intermarriage, however, as important as the decision of the Union was about patrilineal descent, the lack of recognition of patrilineal descent, the controversy over conversion laws, not just in Israel, but also here, limits growth. And finally, as good, that didn't get changed, as good as the Jewish education system is for all of the same reasons, it is still failing to reach the majority of people. And just for an example, Taglit Birthright Israel, whose largest group are identified as Reform Jews, are the children who came out of our synagogues and temples. Birthright Israel, each time it opens up registration, puts on waiting lists, leaves at home more people than it actually sends, and the majority of them are Reform Jews. So I want to give you some data. This is a little bit hard to picture, so I'll give you the word picture of the number figure. What this shows is a recent study that we did, a national study, about 1,500 people of denominational change. And the key number here yes, it worked. The key number here is that only about half of the people that we surveyed who were raised as Reform Jews, as adults say that they are Reform Jews. That the movement lost half of the people, at least in identifying. Where did they go? Well, most of them became just Jewish. Now, that used to be, just Jewish used to be, well, I went to a Reform synagogue, I went to a conservative synagogue, but now I don't go anywhere, I'm just Jewish. It was the label for not being Jewishly engaged. It's a little bit different today. Some of the people in this group are people who are very serious, particularly young people, about their Judaism, but they just don't fit in or think that the label matters a whole lot. Now, one of the other things that you see from this is that that the Reform movement has, if you look at the column for conservative, the second column here, and you see this number 20%, and you see the numbers across the way here, 24%, 13%. Basically what this is saying is that the Reform movement has remained stable because it has lost lots of its own people, but it has gotten people who used to be conservative, who used to be Orthodox. That's not a sustainable model for the future, and it's in particular not a sustainable model for the future if these other denominations, in particular the conservative denomination, is losing lots of members. There won't be the large pool in that movement to become Reform Jews. I call this the arithmetic of intermarriage. And what I want to show you here is that let's assume that there is a 50% rate of intermarriage. Interestingly, if there's a 50% rate of intermarriage, 2/3 of the households are intermarried. In other words, there is a Jew in 2/3, and it's one of the reasons, by the way, that we think that the problem, the issue of intermarriage, is more, if you will, serious or is more pervasive than it actually is because of this. But what you see here is that if 1/3 of these kids and children in intermarried households get Jewish education, we lose 25% of the population. If, however, 67% or 2/3 of them get Jewish education, intermarriage is actually increases the population. So this is one of the ways in which intermarriage is a factor in the growth of the community, and it all depends not on the rate of intermarriage, but on the rate of raising Jewish children, which relates to the kinds of programs that each of you is involved in. Another educational piece of data, this will be a little bit complicated, I'll try to explain it quickly. Recently did a study of engaged teenagers, relatively highly engaged teenagers, mostly from Reform and conservative congregations in New York. We asked both parents and teenagers what was important to them, and these are all post-B'nai Mitzvah adolescents. And what you see is that, perhaps surprisingly, parents, the red line is parents, the blue is teens. Parents and teenagers on the top three are in total agreement. Interestingly, in light of last night's talk, getting into a good college is seen as more important to the kids than it is to their parents, but only slightly. But what's at the bottom of this list? Well, at the bottom of this list, if I can get this here, having a strong Jewish identity, being involved in the Jewish community, leading a ritually observant life. These are also the items on which there is the most disagreement in terms of the relative importance between parents and kids. And one of the challenges is how do we take our adolescents and help them understand that Judaism is not just a text to be read so you know where you came from, but how do you read and understand Jewish texts in a way that is relevant and makes life more meaningful, makes life better. Just as another piece of educational thing, I can't give a presentation where I don't talk about Taglit Birthright Israel. These are our latest data, some cases 10 years after the program, looking at people who are married. And what you see here is that participation in the program, when you take account of everything else, leads to almost a 50% increase in the in-marriage rate. On the right-hand side is the rate for the Reform Jews in the sample. Close to 80% of those who participated in Birthright Israel who are married and came out of the Reform movement married other Jews, either by conversion or they were born Jews. And that compares to under 50%, same people, same background, same everything, who did not participate in the program. What are the challenges? And I'm wrapping up now. So I'm going to give you 3 challenges. I like alliterative stuff. So we got agency, authenticity, and actualization. If I didn't need alliteration, I might have stated a little bit differently. But what are these 3 challenges? Well, the agency challenge, it's a psychological term having to do with a sense of control, is how do we empower young people? How do we empower people who are not so young, while at the same time functioning as a collective? In some ways, it's the challenge of having a community. How do we respond to what's called the DIY, the design-it-yourself Judaism? We, in some ways, in the Reform movement, encourage it. Reform Judaism is Judaism that you decide that you want to do. How do we respond to that? How can we have communities where people are come into the room at the same time and listening to the same person and engaging in similar conversations if everybody's designing their own thing? How do we create authenticity? And I cannot tell you how important this is and how often it comes up when we interview young people, older people. People want an authentic experience. Sometimes it means that they want tradition. because it feels more authentic. In other cases, it means something different. And I think the final issue is, how do we actualize this? How do we engage liberal Jews not only in their heads, not only in their hearts emotionally, but in their behavior as well? How do we create communities that are not only communities of ideas, but how do we create communities of ideas, of emotion and feeling, and of action and behavior? And then just finally, just to one of my favorite quotes from Albert Einstein, who wrote this before, just as the Nazis came to power in Germany, just to remind us what this enterprise is all about. I won't read it, but this notion that we are a people pursuing knowledge, pursuing justice, pursuing personal independence. And he says that's what he thanks his lucky stars he's Jewish for. Thank you.
Go ahead.
Just a note on how the agenda for the rest of the program today. You should have index cards by your seat. If you have questions, please do write them down as we go. After Professor Cohen speaks, we will have people collecting them. We're going to have a short just discussion up here, the three of us first, and then I will try and take as many of the questions by reading them before we end our program. It's my pleasure now to introduce Professor Stephen Cohen, a sociologist of American Jewry who is research professor of Jewish social policy at Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion and director of the Berman Jewish Policy Archive at NYU Wagner. In 1992, he made Aliyah and taught for 14 years at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Previously, he taught at Queens College with visiting appointments at Yale, Brandeis, and JTS. With Arnold Eisen, he wrote The Jew Within, and with Charles Liebman, he wrote Two Worlds of Judaism, the Israeli and American Experiences. His earlier books include American Modernity and Jewish Identity, and American Assimilation or Jewish Revival. His current research interests focus on the emerging patterns of Jewish identity and community among Jews in their 20s and 30s. Professor Cohen serves as research director of Synagogue 3000, senior counselor to the chancellor at JTS, and director of the Florence G. Heller JCCA Research Center. In 2011, he received an honorary doctorate from the Spertus Institute of Jewish Studies. In 2010, he received the Marshall Sklar Award of the Association for the Social Scientific Study of Jewry and was cited as one of the Forward 50 for the second time. The book Sacred Strategies, of which he is co-author, just won a National Jewish Book Award. He is married to Rabbi Marian Lev Cohen, and they live in Jerusalem and New York. His daughter Adit attends the Hebrew University School of Law, and his son Adam lives in New Jersey with his wife and two children. Please welcome Professor Stephen Cohen.
Thank you. Now what? There are several corrections to make in that wonderful bio of mine that you read, that I wrote that you read. The only one I want to make is that Edith actually has gone on to the prosecutor's office of, she's finished law school and she's been prosecuting some of the most unimaginable criminals you could possibly imagine in Israel, and I'm very, very proud of her. So that, the other stuff we could leave for another time. Anyway, this has been, this has the aura of duality to speakers, to positions. Yeah. So I was taught by a friend of mine that there are two types of people in the world: those who divide the world into two, and those who don't. So I would like to divide the world into three. And generally, I have found in my thinking, in my career, in my personal life, that one can arrive at liberal or dovish solutions with a hawkish or anxious analysis. That usually hawks and liberals or doves go together. It's the truly creative and imaginative among us who manage to put together a consciousness of threats and challenge and say, and that's why we need to do all the exciting and important things which, in a sense, look liberal and hopeful and so forth and so on. So I clearly want to begin almost at the end and say that Len and I so for those of you who are looking for a debate, I can assure you that there was little or nothing on that set of slides with which I take issue, and I loved Len's alliterative adumbration at the end. Couldn't do it all, and I certainly would agree. So instead of talking about demography and such things, I want to talk about in a sense, give a kind of socio-historical cultural analysis in the next 9 minutes of American Jewry to make us aware of some of the challenges that face us and that I can see from my own life. Len was born in 1947, I was born in 1950, and I guess we were children around the same time. And at that time, in the 50s and 60s, as I recall, it was a time when middle-class Americans had to be something. You had to be religious. There was a book that came out by Will Herberg, which I didn't read when I was 5 years old, but in college I read Protestant Catholic Jew. And Will Herberg said, Americans have to be something, and they can be Protestant or Catholic or Jew. And that was the time. And the book actually was well received, and it seemed like it made a lot of sense in the Eisenhower Kennedy years. And it was a time when middle-class people had to join a congregation. It was a time of low interreligious marriage, as Protestants, Catholics, and Jews disagreed on many things, but they agreed on one thing: you should marry within your faith. It was a time of strong group loyalties, when Republicans were Republicans and Democrats were Democrats, and Americans were Americans. We were loyal to our family, our community, our locality, our political party, our nation, consumer brands. This was really a different era in which we're living. And Jews, in terms of their connections to one another, also had a very, sounds a little odd, but I think we understand it. Jews were socially excluded from interaction with others. I grew up as a non-observant, lazy Orthodox Jew. There are still some of those around. Mostly, they're not in America, but they're in Canada and Israel and other places. And in my bar mitzvah, we had 20 tables. 19 of them were all Jewish, and the 20th was my father's customers, who were all non-Jewish. And that described this is this century. This is in a way. This is 1963. This was the world in which I grew up, and then thousands and thousands of other people. Let's move the clock, the calendar forward, and let's look at today and how America has changed and how Jews' relationship to the world has changed. We now live in an age of religious and ethnic options. You can decide whether to be religious, whether to be ethnic, how to be religious. You can make up all kinds of ways of being religious. It's perfectly acceptable. You can decide, if you decide to be religious, you can decide to join a congregation, a church or synagogue or whatever. And we're living in a period of all kinds of religious blurring. There's always there's one headline after another. One is, hey, we just found out that people change their religion over their life cycle. There's a fellow running for another party, it's Newt Gingrich, he's had a few religions and a few other things too, but yes, he's had a few. I don't like him. But in this way, Newt does represent what's happening in America. People change their religion over the life course. People certainly marry across religious lines. They adopt both religions, one religion, a third religion, a compromise, no religion. All those are possibilities. And in fact, in the Jewish case, adopting no religion is the worst possibility of a so-called interfaith marriage. It's a faithless marriage. People have many more friends outside their religious and ethnic group. And not only do they change religious identities, not only do they make it up, not only do they say that it's the way you should practice or be religious, they also have religious identities that coexist. The phenomenon is called hybridity, which is a nice way of saying you're a hybrid. You have many identities floating around inside of you. Some of them we think are acceptable. If you're Jewish and Buddhist, well, that's okay. That's a Jew, but we know who you are. That's fine. Now, if you're Jewish and a Messianic Jew, no. That's... What if you're Jewish and Christian? I'm doing a Jewish population study with many colleagues. Scott Shea is chair of the committee. The committee decided, with our encouragement, that if you're Christian, you could be Jewish. It turns out lots of people say, thousands, right? Not most. Thousands of people say, I'm Jewish. What's your religion? Some version of Christianity. Then you have to keep talking. Tell me why. And we've accepted many of those people as Jewish. They have a good story to tell. One woman says, I'm Jewish when I'm with my father, and I'm Christian when I'm with my mother. True story. My husband was Jewish, so he passed away. I guess that makes me Jewish, or partially Jewish. My grandchild is Jewish. Non-Jewish woman, non-Jewish daughter, let's say, marries a Jewish man, raises a Jewish child. Therefore, the grandmother becomes partially Jewish. No, I don't find this laugh, but all right, good, laugh. No, it's fine. It wasn't an intentional joke. I'm just trying to indicate the fluidity and hybridity of the situation. This is the world in which we live. Now, in this world of hybridity, episodic engagement, experimentation, and so forth, we have a world and a larger Jewish population than many of us had thought, although my footnote in 2001 said that as well. In that world, how are we doing? Well, we have a lot of pride, justified pride, in the many successful aspects of Reform Judaism in America. Nifty, some of the congregations, Tefillah. I can make a list and you'll sum me up what you left off. This one and that thing, and there's these lay leaders and rabbis and cantors, so forth and so on, all legitimate. There are many instances of excellence and of unparalleled performance. But I could be misreading things, and in which case, forgive me. But it seems to me that we have a misplaced confidence in the current state of affairs. There's an implicit assumption that the world is moving towards two camps. There's the Orthodox. By the way, as Len may have mentioned, but I'll underscore, part of the reason for the expansion of the Jewish population is the rapid expansion of the Orthodox population. Before I started looking at these data very closely in the last few years, I was unaware of the enormity of the expansion of the Orthodox. In Israel, you know about it, and I'm telling you now, there's a huge increase, and the Orthodox are doing something that they didn't do before. They used to leak. They used to get rid of people like me and move us into other places where we contribute in other ways. My wife's a Reform rabbi. She went to Ramaz Yeshiva for 12 years. They stopped leaking. They are no longer supplying the other streams of Judaism. As Len mentioned, those numbers are shrinking. We are not getting as many Orthodox imports as we used to. They're holding their own, and they are growing enormously. I think we all have to start learning how to speak Orthodox. So there's this assumption, there's going to be two camps. There's the Orthodox camp, and the other one, well, we don't call it reform, we call it liberal. I find the use of the word liberal objectionable. Worse than that, but I have several identities: secular, Zionist, Orthodox, conservative, reform, feminist, Democrat. I have all those identities. The small part of me, which is conservative, says it's not right to call conservative Jews liberal. There's something that's a contradiction. But there's an implicit, call it imperialist assumption, that one day all the non-Orthodox Jews will be liberal, which means that's us. We're in the center. I believe that that's a mistaken view of the future. Rather, we have to come to grips with the fact that we know that the conservative movement is in decline. Well documented, I've helped to do that. What we haven't recognized is that in terms of the number of adult Jews, the reform movement is in decline. The decline of the reform movement among Jews has been masked by the entry, this huge expansion, as Len points out, of intermarried families in reform temples. That means if half of the new families are intermarried, that means that we get one set of dues. But we respect the other person who decided not to become Jewish, and we've picked up only one Jew, which means that the market share of the relevant population that's reform is like, theoretically, if you had only in-married before, and now you have half in-married, half intermarried, you have 3/4 of the adult Jews who are reform. Reform is commanding a smaller market share of the Jewish population, even conceding the intermarried as part of the population. The reform numbers are indeed going down from one population study to another. The world may change, but until recently, I haven't seen evidence that more than 10% of the grandchildren of the intermarried identify as Jews, that may be raised in any way, shape, or form. There's huge intermarriage among Jewishly educated Jewish children of the intermarried. So although we can get them for one generation, we're creating a path for demographic decline. And I think, coming down to all this, where am I on all this, is that my ending, which is not alliterative, although it may be useful, is that we are all suffering. In fact, all the movements, Orthodox, conservative, reform, secular, we're all suffering from the same problem, and that is, once we left the traditional world, once we became modern and now postmodern, how do we deal with two problems? How do we deal with boundaries, and how do we deal with norms? Norms meaning things Jews should do. How do we have a language of should? All three movements, all four, whatever you want to call it, all four or five movements have inadequate answers to the question of how do you tell Jews this is what you should do? We haven't figured out how to do that. The other problem we haven't figured out how to deal with is boundaries. How do you define people in and how do you define people out? And there I'll make one point, and that is we have advanced the notion of soft and porous boundaries. Come on in, join us. The problem with soft and porous boundaries coming in is that they're also soft and porous going out. And there's a literature in the sociology of religious groups in America which says that it's been the strict churches which are strong. Churches that erect some boundaries, but not too high. I mean, no, not Amish, but if they're high enough, they become valuable coming in, and then people find value once they get there. So in order to get more religious customers, you have to raise the price, which was where norms come in. You have to ask people to do things and to think things that are difficult, that will annoy some people, will get rid of some people, but will bring people in. What are those things? In the past, they've been wear funny clothes, eat weird food, sleep with this person, your spouse, then, but not the other time, So we've had all these, and show up a lot. Those probably are not the boundaries that we want to, the norms that we want to promulgate. But there are other norms. And wherever we are, I just opened the resolutions. It's a very long, admirable resolution on economic justice. It pains me that Warren Buffett isn't a Reform Jew. We have a lot of rich Jews in the Reform movement. Why are the movement of Tikkun Olam, the movement of economic and social justice, why hasn't there been 10 Reform millionaires who've gotten up and said, this country is going in the wrong direction? And everything that's in that resolution, why aren't they saying that with passion as leading Reform Jews? I have an idea why they haven't said it, but that's for us. That's for us to do, to become a movement that really, really has very, very strong norms, so that we have very, very strong boundaries, so that we can attract more people and grow a stronger, richer, and more powerful reform movement going forward. Thank you.
Can you hear me? Yes? Well, thank you both. I'm going to start with a couple of questions. If people want to raise your hands and pass your cards toward the aisles, we will have volunteers coming through to pick them up. But first, I want to. It sounds like both of you agree that the data is. Pardon? You can't hear me. Okay. It sounds like both of you agree that the data shows a decline in the numbers of Reform Jews, or those who identify as Reform Jews. And so here we are meeting as a movement on the cusp of new changes and transitions. We're launching a major campaign for youth engagement. What are the implications for our movement in terms of that particular finding?
Well, I don't know that the number of Reform Jews is declining. My guess is that it is more or less steady, but that's really a negative because the Reform movement should be busting at the seams. Our camps should be busting at the seams. Our program should be busting at the seams because the ideology of the Reform movement is closer to the ideology of most American Jews. You get into a discussion in terms of how many, it's a parallel to who is a Jew. The critical issue here is what is the difference between a Reform Jew, who if you ask them what's your identity as a Jew, they say I'm a Reform Jew, versus someone who's a member of a Reform congregation. And so one of the phenomena that may be out there is that there is actually a lower number of people who are members of Reform congregations, who are dues-paying members, while the number of people who consider themselves Reform Jews is much increased. So these are, I mean, one of the problems is, and as Stephen said, the boundaries are much more fluid. And just like people, they don't buy the same brand anything from week to week, from month to month, it is much more of a consumer market out there. But we have this major problem the Reform Union has this major problem because to say that you are a Reform Jew is not the same thing as to say, I am a member of a Reform congregation.
I would just we may have a difference on looking at the numbers, but we may not. But we both agree that the Reform market share, not only of American Jews, but certainly the congregational market share of Reform identifying Jews has been in decline.
Yes. So market share, absolutely. I mean, while some people may say
that... What do you mean by market share?
The percentage of people who say they're Reform who also belong to Reform
Temple. To a synagogue, okay.
But also the percentage of people who say that they're Reform out of the total number. that one of the problems is that our denominator has been too small, and so it's made it look like there was more engagement, there was more success, there was more participation in federations as well as congregations because we had too small a denominator.
So the one thing I'll throw out, there's a lot to say, is that in this age, people are looking for personal connection and community. It turns out that small churches or congregations with small groups within them actually create higher levels of performance than large congregations without those groups. In addition, there is a philosophy, and this I really do want to attribute to my work with Synagogue 3000. There's a philosophy that's pretty standard, the philosophy of operation among Reform leadership, both professional and rabbinic and educational, that we want to create programs to bring as many Jews as possible into our synagogues. Instead, we should think about how do we create personal relationships with as many Jews, frankly, on a retail basis. That means lots of time in coffee shops. That means lots of Yiddishkeit going on in people's homes and not in the temple. That means allowing for all kinds of strange activities to take place, perhaps in the synagogue, perhaps alongside. That means attention to pastoral needs and really helping people. Basically, be a good person. It will, and do it on a one-to-one basis. It takes a lot of time and a lot of work, but unfortunately, for the reasons that I outlined, we don't have society herding people into our temples anymore. And therefore, we have to meet them on a one-to-one basis, build those relationships, and as Len says, and so many others have said, empower them to create their own community under our auspice.
Let me ask you about our campaign for youth engagement, and we spoke last week by phone. Most of us hear and believe that camp experiences, that Israel educational experiences really do a lot towards maintaining Jewish continuity, keeping those Jews, when they become adults, engaged in Jewish life. And I guess my question would be, do they also stay affiliated with our synagogues? And can you comment on that?
You want to do yes and yes, or yes and yes?
Go.
Yes and yes.
Speakers, please stand.
Sure.
Yeah, they
All right,
can't see it.
I'm sorry. You're totally correct. I mean, I've heard of hiding the Lord's face, but that was not meant to do that at all. There is really incontrovertible evidence that camping experience and Israel experience have these powerful long-range effects. There's problems of measurement bias and self-selection and all that others, but it doesn't matter. When you look at people who were raised Reform and went to camp versus not, as Len points out, people who were raised Reform and went to Israel or not, the differences are just so large that whatever methodological problems you might have in saying, oh, these are special people, so forth and so on, really, you just can't buy it. So the answer is,
Yes.
From an educational point of view, I have different standards, so to speak, for each movement in terms of like where I make the cut. If I have to make two, for the Orthodox world, it's day school yeshiva versus not. For the conservative world, it's day school / supplementary school in the high school years. For the Reform movement, if I have to pick one indicator of Jewish education, it's camping. It's such a powerful indicator. And later on, when they get to young adult stage, no question, have you been to Israel or not becomes such a valuable predictor of future involvement in Jewish life. 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, you can see it. By the way, you can even see effects of preschool. A kid who went to preschool at age 3 in a Jewish preschool, for lots of reasons, which, not just a preschool, obviously, is engaged in Jewish life at a higher rate 50 years later.
So I want to second Stephen's comments, but I want to add the following nuance. No doubt that camp and Israel experience are associated with higher levels of involvement, just look around the room, look around the leadership of the union. They met at camp, and the differentiation is this group met at Eisner, and this group met at Coleman, et cetera. But
they're having trouble hearing you.
okay, so I will speak up even louder. What we should be learning from that is not that we should be sending everybody to camp. We should be sending everybody to camp. But what we should be learning is that intensive education, that education that is more like 24/7 education, is the model that we need to adopt. And I also think that in terms of the youth engagement initiative, that we can't simply do better what we are currently doing. That we currently don't have an adequate transition from B'nai Mitzvah to full adult status in the community. And it is not about slowly getting our young people more engaged in the things that we do as adults. What we need to do is to connect their Jewish learning, their Jewish understanding, their Jewish identity with the world at large, to make clear to them, as I said earlier, that Jewish ideas are relevant for modern life.
Professor Cohen, do you have any suggestions in terms of the content of our campaign for Jewish engagement on the kinds of programs? Not everyone will go to camp. Not everyone will have an Israel experience, but are there models of what you see as successful in other ways?
I would focus on two objectives. One is, it turns out that if I had to pick one variable to predict Jewish involvement at any point in life, I would ask people, of your closest friends, how many are Jewish? You have, all or most, some, so forth and so on. If I had to pick one predictor of all the other things that we care about, I'd pick that one. And then I would note that, speaking about my childhood and my children's childhood and my grandchildren's childhood, that American Jews have drastically reduced the number of Jewish friends that they have. So it was not an educational act in 1963 Brooklyn to give me Jewish friends. That was, but in 2013, Scarsdale, or Phoenix, or Albuquerque, it is a Jewish educational act to bestow our children with other Jewish friends. And now I want to say one more thing that's going to be a little touchy. I've been in 30, 40 years, I've been in rooms with Israel educators who kind of smirk and smile, and they say, if our children find romance on these trips, putting it nicely, it's probably a good thing. I want to speak very frankly that there is a need to create situations early in the creation of the erotic psyche of our teenagers as to who they find attractive. There is research that shows that people who are ethnically comfortable are attracted to people of the same ethnicity. People who are ethnically uncomfortable are attracted to people of the opposite ethnicity. All those Philip Roth stories you read, there's a germ of truth there. In the age in which we're living, we need various ways to promote Jewish in marriage, and if not, then of course we're going to try to engage and welcome people and educate people afterwards. But better that Jews should marry Jews, and we can change, and we do in fact change the odds by providing Jews, young Jews, with more Jewish social contacts, and I'm suggesting also helping to shape the ways in which they view their romantic possibilities. How you do that? I need a foundation grant to work with you on it, but in all seriousness, I think we can understand what it means to create situations in which young Jews are finding themselves in the company of other young Jews. And part of Len's remarks, which is so right about the 24/7 nature of these experiences, incorporates everything I just said.
So I will let Stephen be the erotic educator.
Is it erotic educator or?
This is for the audience to decide. But I will say the social science principle is what everybody's talking about, what Gladwell has popularized, social networks. Social networks are critical, and they're critical not only to friendships, but they're critical to how people learn, how people develop values. And we need to be much more systematic in how we create social networks among young Jews. I think actually the question before about everybody can't go to camp. Why not? Why can't you? If rabbis can require as a condition for celebrating bar bat mitzvah that somebody go to services 8 times within 52 weeks, why can't they require that people go to camp for
Well, actually,
10 days?
if Warren Buffett were Jewish and wanted to support the URJ camps, we could.
Well, it's something worth looking at, and Shabbatot and other ways to create the social network and to take the intensity of camp and Israel experience and bring it home is critical.
I'm going to ask one more question, and then if we have, where are the cards that are being collected from the audience? If you could just bring them up. But now I want to turn to the other end of the demographic spectrum, my generation, the baby boomers. And a lot of it has been written about we will live longer, and we have a way of relating to synagogues and in Jewish community that's very different than younger Jews. So for synagogues, that could be an interesting challenge, and we also may have some wealth to support the synagogues for the things that we see as valuable. Where do you see that playing out in terms of the role of our synagogues?
So one of the problems is that people leave synagogues when their children grow up. The $2,500 a year is no longer a valuable investment if they're only going to go 3 times a year. And we need in our synagogue communities to figure out ways of keeping people as part of the community, creating lifelong communities, not just communities designed to educate the next generation. It means, by the way, that we put an emphasis on Jewish education, not for the youngest people, but for the oldest people. That we put Jewish education at the top of the agenda for every segment of the community. It means that we figure out how to create communities in, whether it's Florida or the Berkshires or Cape Cod or wherever it is that people go when they leave the suburban homes where many American Jews have been located. We need to take account of the demographics. And as was said earlier, in terms of the pastoral focus, congregations have to learn how to serve the needs of elderly populations, which are very, very different than the needs of those with young children.
Real quick, I'm living with this on 2 levels. I'm in the middle of analyzing a population study. I've learned that the biggest growth group of the last 10 years has been Jews 85 and over. The second biggest growth group has been Jews 75 to 84. The next biggest growth group will be us. In the next 10 years, we'll see a huge explosion of Jews 65 to 74. We're coming. Some of us are here already. So everything you're saying is true, and we're going to be healthy and wealthy and wise and all that. And the other part of my life, I live with Rabbi Marion Lev Cohen, whose portfolio is serve this population at Central Synagogue. And she serves them as a rabbi through personal contact, through building community, through doing all kinds of work that is not typical of other people. And I'm not sure how, Central is keeping her. From my point of view, this is very good business. It pays to hire rabbis to to be working with this population. You save a few memberships, you've got the whole salary paid for. I'm just talking very business-like fashion. It is not true for 16-year-olds. We don't keep families as much, we do some. We don't necessarily keep families in our synagogues because we're being nice to the 15-year-old whose family didn't leave. But it is definitely the case that we have older people who can take their money and their donations and their energy anywhere they want, and when they get personal attention, they stay, and they stay with us. That's not the reason to do this. I'm just saying that's the way we can fund this, what has to be this major effort. And I also hear there's a little bit of a problem with getting enough rabbis employed. This opens up a whole other way of keeping rabbis. Marion has a job. It's not for her. But I'm saying this is such a critical area. And last point. We are now entering the first time in Jewish history. Larry Hoffman may tell me that there was a time in the Bible, but let's put that one aside. The first time in recorded Jewish history where we have 4 adult Jewish generations participating in the leadership of the community. I have a donor, major donor in one of my projects. He's 93 years old. I have staff, and they're 23 years old. And I'm 61 years old. I'm living in this multi-generational community. How will we create communities and leadership such that these people can coexist, can run parallel to each other? So you can have a community for older people and a community for 20s and 30s, as well as our bread and butter, our people in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. How do we do that? We have not yet confronted this problem, but this problem is coming. In fact, it's not only coming, it has arrived.
Let me turn to some of the questions that we've received. Several people were asking, and this is primarily for you, Dr. Saxe, about the question of the data. And that there was a recent article in the New York Times stating that there is no really good data on the total number of Jews in the country, since many Jews...
It was the Wall Street Journal.
Wall Street Journal.
It was his colleague, John Fasano.
All right, so why don't you explain what the article said and your response?
So this was a column by my good friend and colleague, Jonathan Cerna in the Wall Street Journal. And the issue is actually stimulated by a conference that we held at Brandeis in October about the, yes, I'm trying to use it. And the issue is the National Jewish Population Survey. So the UJC, now the JFNA, which had sponsored the 2000 survey, decided, in part as a result of controversy over the 2000 survey, not to fund and co-sponsor a 2010 study. But Jonathan was wrong in a couple of ways, and I've told him this, so it's not a secret. One, there's confusion about a census and a survey. We in America, in the United States of America, because of the Constitution and because of policy decisions by Jewish organizations, among others, do not permit the census to ask questions about religion in the way that they're asked in most other Western countries. So we don't have official statistics about who the people who identify as Jews are. But it's not that we don't have any data. It turns out we have lots of data. Every survey, other than the census, which is required, if you don't fill it out, at least in theory, you could be arrested, you could be fined. Every other survey done by the government about healthcare and education and all sorts of things asks questions about people's religious and ethnic identity. It's part of the demographic panel. And we know from these surveys exactly how many Jews, people who say that their religion is Jewish. The problem is that we don't know how many people consider themselves Jewish by non-religious criteria, by ethnic criteria. And we decided in creating that estimate of 6.5 million to assume we took the lowest estimate of the proportion of any study that's been done in the last decade of the proportion of Jews by criteria other than religion, which is about 15%. The percentages go up to 25%, and that's how we get to the 6.5 million number. We're now trying to validate this by looking at the number of children who celebrate bar bat mitzvah. One of the problems, by the way, with the 2000 survey, and one of the reasons that we knew it was wrong, is that the survey found that almost 1 out of 3 children who were identified were in day schools, were in Jewish day schools. And everything else that we knew about the American Jewish community said that that couldn't possibly be true. So we're trying to back into this thing, but that's where the basic data are. And we actually have lots of information, and Jonathan and I have had lots of interesting conversations the last 2 weeks.
Let me ask you another data-related question, and that is about the birthright population, the young adults that go on that trip. Is it a self-selecting group, and how does that affect your data as well?
So I described the birthright sample as Noah's Ark. There is at least 2 of every subvariant and species of American Jewry, and there are 7 special species. Basically, it represents American Jewry, except at the extreme level of engagement and non-engagement. So because you are ineligible if you've been on a prior program, educational program to Israel, it excludes virtually all of the Orthodox. Because people who don't even consider themselves Jewish wouldn't apply, it excludes people who might by other criteria be Jewish. But by and large, it looks pretty much like what every study has suggested about the shape of the American Jewish community. By the way, the data, one of my favorite questions to ask of the birthright applicants is their knowledge of Hebrew. And what we find is that 20%, 25% don't know Aleph from Bet. It means they've been untouched by any kind of formal Jewish education. 20% have some degree of fluency, and 50%, and I actually think that this is a very sad commentary, 50% say that they can read, but they don't know what they're reading. And these are the people, unfortunately, who are the B'nai Mitzvah of, well, I'll take heat from Stephen later about this, but these are the B'nai Mitzvah of liberal traditions.
Let me, and now for you, Dr. Cohen. This has to do with you're talking about the boundaries for entry being soft and porous. And this is a question about if we need clear rather than porous boundaries, how do we address the conflict between welcoming the non-Jewish member into our congregation, but defining the non-Jewish member's role in a way which is respectful of their individual role in our community, but also respectful of our boundaries and what it means to be a Jew?
Well, when I was referring to boundaries, I wasn't talking about Jew, non-Jew, that whole question of should the grandparent be up on the bima when the Torah gets... No, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm saying that we have to have boundaries that you can say when you go to Temple Bethel, which is the most common name for a temple in America, but so I'm sure many of you are Temple Bethel members.
Said by a Cohen.
How many Bethel presidents are there in the room? No, don't answer.
A lot of Emmanuels, too.
Number 2. It's like Levine. I'm saying that our temples ought to be, and our communities ought to be highly distinguished from a point of view of style, of theology, of politics, of all the things that makes Jewish life rich. And you know what? I'm looking at Danny Zemmel over there, and I remember we had a conversation in your office about 3 years ago, and I won't tell the crowd which place you were pointing to. But you were saying, you know what, if you don't have to come here, you can go there. And you were very happy. You wanted people who belonged in Temple Micah to be in Temple Micah. But if they don't belong in Temple Micah, it's not a good place to be. Better they should be over there. And they should feel that way as well. So we all want more Temple Micahs and not Temple Bethels. We want Temple Micahs that have distinctive identities that make it difficult to be a Temple Micah member unless you like doing what Temple Micah does, and Temple Bethel and the Academy and whatever it may be. And I think that we believe we're nervous about setting high standards because we'll think we'll blow people away. I think we will create more enthusiasm, and the enthusiasts will find other enthusiasts who believe that they should be in this community. So that's what I meant about raising our boundaries, making it possible for people to say, I don't belong here. And say, thank you, Gesundheit, go over there, or not. But you're right, you don't belong here. But the people we want here, let them come here and let them be with us and build strong communities.
Could I just comment quickly? So I want to say another word about, before I trip, I want to say another word about boundaries and say it in a slightly different way. And I'll do some self-revelation as Stephen did. I am a Reformed Jew. I was born a Reformed Jew. That was my family. I was a bar mitzvah in a Reformed synagogue. I don't currently participate in a Reform synagogue. I'm part of two minyanim. And one of the boundaries that I have created for myself is around Shabbat. And it's only something that's happened to me in the last 5 or so years. I found that by being observant in one very particular way, turning off my computer, not answering email from the beginning of Shabbat to Havdalah, is one of the ways in which I can keep my own pretty nutty life in some semblance of balance. And it does all sorts of things for me. And I think in this case, and I want to contrast it with Stephen's comment about, there are some places where, you're not comfortable, you are comfortable. I think that we need to take something like Shabbat and draw some boundaries around it and try through education, not through coercion, to engage people in the meaningful experience of that. I'll give one final example. I was talking last night with someone here and mentioning that I often get asked by friends whose children have met, their beshert is a non-Jew, and the parents are inevitably bereft. What can I do? Len, you know the data. What works? What could I do? And I say to them, and how can I persuade my son, my daughter, that they either have to get the person to convert or find another person? I said, you're not going to do that. It's just not the way it works. If you want to do something to ensure that your grandchildren are Jewish, create the most wonderful Shabbat dinners and invite your son, daughter, and his lover, her lover, to dinner. You show them that there is something of meaning and of purpose and of value in Judaism, and they will come to Judaism. And you know what? I have 3 examples, and it has worked.
Now, is this based on data, Dr. Saxe, or?
Anecdotal data, 3 cases.
Thank you. Actually, this is a question that was, is there any kind of characterizations you have of Reformed Jewish households that increase or decrease the chance that our children will raise their children as Jews?
I think when designing new questions to get at new forms of Jewish identity, I insisted upon 3 questions, and I think they answer your question. One is Shabbat table. How often do you have a Shabbat meal? So it's just a measure, but it's also an answer to your question that totally reflects Wednesday. Second, how many of your friends are Jewish? Your closest friends. And third, how often do you talk about Jewish matters with your friends? I think those 3 questions put together, they're not institutional, they're highly personal, they're subjective, they're social. So if you have a home in which you have a Shabbat table, you talk about Jewish things, and you have lots of Jewish friends coming in and out of the house, and you surround your children with Jewish friends, the chances that they will be engaged in Jewish life in a variety of ways will be all that more improved. There probably are other things as well. I'm sure the rabbis have very lofty ideas of what has to happen in that home. I'm a simple man. I'm an ethnic Jew. So if you live that life, you live a life with other Jews around Shabbos and talking about Jewish matters, you're gonna be intensively Jewish. You're gonna pass that intensity to your children.
So I don't know we don't have good data on what is the home that will produce, most likely to produce Jewish grandchildren, although I support Stephen's sense that if the parents aren't doing it, it is more difficult. But I want to have one amendment to that. One of the most interesting phenomena that I've observed over the last couple of years is how children are teaching their parents to be Jewish. I've been on a plane a couple of times the last year or two to Israel, to Tel Aviv, and have met families of Bogrei Taglit, families of people who've been on birthright. And the mother or the father will say to me, "This is my first time in Israel. I'm going with my son, my daughter. They came back from birthright and they said, 'Mom, Dad, you need to go to Israel.'" And so the kids are bringing them along. By the way, did a study a couple of years ago in the former Soviet Union, in St. Petersburg and Moscow, where the adult generation, by law, was removed from, not allowed to learn about their Jewish history, traditions, and rituals. And we were studying camps that were set up by the Saxe, by the Jewish Agency for kids. We went back 6 months, 8 months later to their homes, and we interviewed the parents. And the kids would come home from camp, and it was Friday night or even Saturday night, and they would say, "We need to do Shabbat, we need to light the candles, or Havdalah, we need to do Havdalah." And the parents would say, "What are you talking about?" But in fact, the kids were so turned on to their Jewish identity by their camp experience that they brought their parents along. So it can happen both ways. And I think particularly because of the trends that Stephen described, the problems in the Jewish education system over the 50s and the 60s and the 70s, that we have a generation of young people that may be more knowledgeable, more educated, more comfortable, more motivated than their parents.
There's a question about support for Israel, and in this kind of new context of Jewish identification, is support for Israel, can it still be used as a litmus test for affiliation, or was it ever?
I don't know if it was ever. What is the?
That's what it.
That you read it, and now you have no
it.
responsibility for the question.
Absolutely.
No, it's all right. I like the system.
Take it as a projective
it's like,
test.
You know, God gave it to
You
Moshe,
can reframe the
to
question.
Yeshua, the rabbi. Fine. It's not my fault. So, putting aside the litmus test issue, I want to distinguish in that question being attached to Israel, which I regard as pro-Israel, and being pro-Israel government. And the real challenge that we're facing right now is that the definition of pro-Israel is being narrowed by a complicit arrangement between Israel's strongest advocates and Israel's strongest critics. The advocates are saying, if you're not pro-Israel in the way all the Republicans are, then you're not pro-Israel and you're not helping the cause go away. And the critics are saying, well, the advocates are saying we're not pro-Israel. So fine, we're not pro-Israel, and they're shutting up. I can tell you, we don't have all the time. I can tell you, I can give you poignant stories that I witnessed with my own eyes of young people who refuse to become engaged, either singing Hatikva or signing an anti-settlement petition. The same young people, by the way. They couldn't do this and they couldn't do that. Why? The issue's too hot. I'll get killed. It's too complicated. And these people are indeed, in my book, pro-Israel. They speak Hebrew. They've studied in Israel. We're not talking about people who are distant from us. So the major challenge today is how do we keep, we're talking about open tent, talking about diversity, inclusiveness, and welcoming. How do we welcome people who think that the Israeli government is set on an expansionist, imperialist, and sometimes theocratic and racist course? If you believe that, but you're pro-Israel, you're probably a Zionist, you're probably a reader of Haaretz. I'm speaking to you as an Israeli. I made Aliyah. I'm speaking to you as someone who's voted labor all my life as an Israeli. I've been a labor Zionist since 1969 when I worked for the Israeli government on campus. And I'm telling you that we have a real problem of narrowing that tent. I'm saying this so openly to you because this is the reform movement. There are 3 of you who don't agree with me, I understand. But God bless you, we want you to. Tell them what Klein, I love them. But we need to fight, and this is what I'm talking about fighting. We need to fight for the right of Jews to be pro-Israel and anti-Likud. It really is a legitimate position. And right now, we're losing that fight. And from this point forward, we're going to start winning that fight.
Professor Saxe?
So I agree, I absolutely agree. We cannot confuse political positions with love of Israel. What I have a harder time with is why this issue wouldn't come up and doesn't come up in the context of being Americans. Most of us are Democrats. We lost the 2000 election. We lost the 2004 election. Nobody after those elections claimed that American Jews were disloyal, were unpatriotic. And I think we're facing the same issue. I also want to say, and maybe this is my Pollyannish optimistic side, I think there has been a radical change in the nature of the relationship of American Jews, Amcha, the people, particularly young people, and Israelis. It is no longer just the image of Zion, the parts of our liturgy, the parts of our history that we learned as kids. It is a people-to-people relationship. Last year, more than 50,000 young people from America went to Israel on educational programs and came back, not only with a few romantic relationships, but they came back with relationships with Israelis. The Mifgash, the encounters with Israelis, is the central part of the birthright relationship. 10% of the American Jewish community, by the way, are Russian, are from the former Soviet Union, have emigrated, or the children of people who've emigrated in the last 20 or 30 years. They all have family in Israel. It's a very different situation than before. It is about people-to-people relationships, and I hope that's where we are headed rather than in a difference over political.
We're going to conclude now. I'm going to give each of our speakers 1 more minute to conclude, and I'll just read the final question that I had, but you can say what you would like to in concluding remarks. But as a movement, we have lost our have we lost our relevancy, and is there data on what 30-something Jews want? It's one category we haven't discussed today.
We have not lost our relevancy. And yes, there are data on 30-somethings when they're single, as indeed half of the Jews between 25 and 39 years old are not intermarried. They're not in married. They're not married. Jesus said, between 25 and 39 years old, around half of non-Orthodox Jews are non-married. This has been if you're asking why you have trouble getting membership here or there, a large part of the reason, it's a reason that affects churches as well, is that there's a huge rise in non-marriage, or postponement of marriage, we hope. And that means that population, as it turns out, that's non-married, that's 32 years old, living in the cities, whether living in places where there are relatively few other temples and Jewish institutions. That they live where we ain't, or and their rates of involvement are incredibly low. I look at my data and they're just as low as, roughly as low as intermarried people raising their kids non-Jewish. They're really quite low. These people have really no reason to go to a temple, except for for a special occasion. And they have little opportunity to create Jewish life with other people, except informally. And that's what our challenge is. And who is going to pay to reach out to people who are not going to pay us back right away, and help create Jewish lives for people who are single, living with other married people, maybe with partners, heavily with non-Jewish partners? Who's going to create the staffing and the support and the networks and whatever to reach out to those people? Birthright Next is going to try, and others are trying. Synagogue 3000 is trying. But that also is a major challenge for Jewish life going forward.
So we live in an interesting age. All ages are interesting, but this is particularly interesting because on the one hand, this is the age of the individual. This is the age of empowerment, individual empowerment, the me generation, and so on. But it's also an age in which people, as a result of that, are craving community. I think across the board, we have an issue of why do you need to meet with people anymore? Why not just text them? Why not just email them? For those of us who were college professors, why should we schlep to the classroom when they're just looking at their computers anyway? I could sit at home, I could actually be in my underwear and, do my lecture, let them read it. And, with TED and all of these other new videos, YouTube videos and so on, educational. What's the purpose of education? What's the purpose of face-to-face contact? And I think, in part, what we need to do, and I won't answer the question is, are we relevant? But in order for us to be relevant, we have to demonstrate to people that being a community, joining together, doing things one-on-one, panim al panim, face-to-face, in groups, in community, is important. And I'm interested, I think it is really extraordinary that in this day and age, when somebody can sit wherever they are and say, look, this is being filmed, and watch the filming of this discussion, that 6,700 people would schlep to Washington, not even to Washington, to the outskirts of Washington, suffer long lines and do all of this other stuff to be in relationship with other people. And I think that's what Jewish is about. And if we want to stay relevant, if the reform movement as a modern movement wants to stay relevant, that's what it needs to keep the focus on.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you both very much.